Picture this. You step outside your home on a lazy weekend, only to find a so-called HOA cop writing up a ticket on your car, and you're not even in their HOA. Sounds impossible, right? Think again. I'm Alex Carter, and today's story might sound straight out of an absurd comedy. I never signed any homeowners association agreement, I never paid any HOA dues, and I certainly never expected to be fined by an HOA I didn't belong to. Yet that's exactly what happened when a rogue HOA enforcer decided I was breaking their rules. You can imagine my confusion when this uniformed busybody showed up demanding I move my vehicle because it violated community guidelines. Only there was one tiny catch. I had no affiliation with their HOA. Not a member, not a participant, not a single reason to follow their bizarre regulations, but that didn't stop them. Instead, they doubled down, threatened me with escalating fines, and even claimed they could tow my car if I didn't comply. As you can guess, I wasn't about to roll over. I grabbed my phone, began documenting everything, and set out to uncover how this HOA could even think about fining someone outside its jurisdiction. Was this an honest mistake, or were they trying to pull off an outrageous money grab? Strap in, because this is a tale of entitlement and confusion that turns into a neighborhood-wide showdown. Let's dive into how one overzealous HOA cop learned the hard way that sometimes you really should check who's actually in your association before swinging that ticket book around. I live in a suburban area where multiple HOAs govern different sections of the neighborhood. My street, however, is famously HOA-free. Years ago, the original developer sold these lots to residents who voted not to form or join any formal homeowners association. We all enjoyed the freedom, no monthly fees, no random fines, and the ability to paint our houses however we liked. But recently, an adjacent HOA expanded, taking in new blocks, and apparently decided that my street was now within their domain. I started seeing their newsletters in my mailbox, which I usually tossed in the trash. After all, it didn't concern me, or so I thought. Then came the day I woke up to find a glossy pamphlet taped to my door. "Welcome to our community," it said, with a reminder to comply with community standards. I shrugged it off as a mistake. My property records were crystal clear. No HOA membership, no strings attached. A week later, things escalated. Walking out to my driveway, I found a man in a faux police uniform, badges, patches, the whole shebang, scribbling on a notepad while examining my car. "Excuse me," I said politely. "Can I help you?" He waved a half-filled citation in the air, stating I was in violation of some obscure parking rule. I calmly explained I wasn't part of his association. His response, "Well, the board says otherwise, and I'm here to enforce it." I couldn't decide if this was hilarious or infuriating. That's when I realized I'd need solid proof of my non-member status, because this so-called HOA cop was dead set on fining me. Determined to resolve this, I dug up every document I had, from my home's deed to the community's original development records. Sure enough, nowhere did it mention any HOA membership. Confident in my evidence, I walked over to the adjacent HOA's administrative office. Inside, a bored-looking receptionist perked up when I mentioned I was disputing a fine. She led me to a small room where two HOA board members sat, arms folded. Before I could even start, they insisted their records showed that my street had been annexed into their association. I replied with a polite but firm, "That's impossible," and laid out my documents. One of the board members sighed and said, "We'll look into it," dismissing me as though I was just another troublemaker. They added that, until further notice, my fines would remain valid. I left with the distinct impression that they weren't going to cooperate. Later that day, I found another citation on my car, this time for improper yard maintenance, even though my lawn was freshly mowed. It was clear the board was doubling down, hoping to bully me into compliance, but I wasn't about to cave. Instead, I contacted a local property lawyer, explained the situation, and sent him copies of everything I had. Meanwhile, word spread around the neighborhood that the HOA cop had targeted more than just me. Another resident, also outside the HOA boundaries, got ticketed for excessive weed growth. We realized we weren't alone. It was time to organize and get to the bottom of this unwarranted expansion and these ridiculous fines. A week later, a neighbor named Sarah knocked on my door. She was furious. She'd also been fined despite not belonging to the HOA. Sarah revealed she'd overheard the HOA cop bragging about getting paid extra for every violation he wrote up. Apparently, he wasn't just some naive enforcer. He was deliberately issuing citations to rake in revenue. That night, a small group of us met in my living room to compare notes. Sarah had done some digging and found out this HOA cop was actually an independent contractor, hired by the association to maximize fines. His contract allegedly included a bonus structure. Every ticket meant more cash in his pocket. This was the first major twist. The overreach wasn't just a simple mistake by the HOA, it was a business strategy. We realized that if they could claim our street as part of their domain, even unofficially, they could squeeze money out of unsuspecting homeowners with bogus fines. Armed with this new knowledge, we decided to gather as much evidence as possible to prove the HOA had no legal claim to our properties. We compiled photos of the citations, recorded our conversations with the cop, and took screenshots of every threatening email. Our plan was simple. Once we had an airtight case, we'd confront the HOA board publicly, forcing them to admit they had no jurisdiction over us. As more residents uncovered they'd been wrongly fined, our impromptu group grew in numbers. Many felt duped, having paid previous citations just to avoid hassle. Realizing they'd been scammed enraged them. In fact, a couple of neighbors had already shelled out hundreds in so-called maintenance fees, none of which actually applied to their properties. We set up a private online forum where we shared documents, text messages, and letters from the HOA cop. Stories poured in. One elderly couple had nearly cancelled a vacation, fearing their mailbox would be replaced and fined during their absence. Another family was threatened for having a small garden deemed unapproved landscaping. The more stories we collected, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a random error. The HOA board was systematically targeting homes just beyond their official borders, likely betting that most people wouldn't challenge them. Eventually, we decided to take our findings to a local journalist who specialized in consumer affairs. Her eyes lit up when she saw the stack of fines and discovered our street wasn't even part of the association. She agreed to investigate and warned us to expect strong pushback from the HOA. By now, the community was buzzing. Half the neighbors were outraged at the board's audacity. The other half feared retaliatory fines if they spoke out. We knew confronting the board would be a risk, but it was a risk we had to take, or else we'd remain perpetual targets for this out-of-control revenue scheme. As the journalist's investigation ramped up, a subplot emerged. The HOA was facing financial trouble. Rumor had it they'd spent heavily on a failed park renovation and were now desperate to replenish their funds. Their solution: unleash a pay-by violation system. According to one source who attended board meetings, certain members pushed for aggressive enforcement well beyond their recognized boundaries. They believed if people thought they were part of the HOA, they'd either pay up quietly or join officially to avoid future disputes. Either way, the HOA made money. Meanwhile, the so-called HOA cop intensified his patrols. Residents reported seeing him lurking around at odd hours, shining a flashlight on cars and mailboxes. He'd issue warnings for anything from grass length to a single weed in a flower bed. When confronted, he insisted, "I'm just doing my job." But we knew there was more to it, a paycheck incentive fueling his zeal. Our group also uncovered that the HOA used vague phrases in their newsletters, like, "all community members must comply," without specifically naming roads or blocks. It was deliberate misdirection, playing on people's assumptions. Clearly, the board had orchestrated an elaborate plan: expand unofficially, punish those who didn't realize they weren't actually under HOA authority, and rake in fines. The question was, could we prove it beyond doubt and bring this scheme crashing down? Amidst the rising tension, the emotional burden on residents became evident. Some people worried about confrontation, fearing that even if they weren't in the HOA, it might cost them time, energy, or even legal fees to defend themselves. Others felt guilty, having paid fines to stay off the board's radar. One single mother confided in me that she'd already cancelled her cable service to afford an improper trash can placement fine over a dumpster that was never actually on HOA property. As she spoke, her voice quivered with anger and regret. The conflict spilled over into personal relationships. Some neighbors, loyal to the HOA or simply believing their claims, started gossiping that we just didn't want to follow community standards. At barbecues and local events, you could sense the divide. People quietly chose sides, either supporting our stand against the power grab or siding with the board, hoping to keep the peace. Meanwhile, the HOA cop seemed emboldened by each ticket he wrote. He'd smirk or roll his eyes if anyone tried to argue. His behavior infuriated residents, turning once peaceful driveways into tense standoffs. For me personally, it was exhausting. The constant fear of what petty excuse he might use next was draining. Yet every story of someone else being targeted reminded me why I couldn't just give in. We needed a united approach, a strategy that would protect everyone, not just those brave enough to speak up. Late one evening, I received a frantic call from Sarah. She was in tears because the HOA cop had pounded on her door, brandishing a new violation for excessive noise when she was simply watching a movie at normal volume. He threatened that her next fine would be doubled if she didn't cooperate. This marked a new escalation. He was no longer just targeting cars or yards. He was monitoring what people did inside their homes. It was beyond intrusive. Rumors spread that he'd been checking mailboxes for stray flyers or random documents to justify further citations. It felt like living under surveillance in a place that was supposed to be free from HOA rule. At the same time, the local journalist we'd spoken to began publishing teasers about an upcoming exposé. She hinted at a massive overreach from an unnamed HOA. The board must have caught wind, because the next day they sent a mass email claiming outsiders were spreading misinformation. They urged everyone to pay attention to official communications, which conveniently included new forms that implied optional membership for adjoining streets. This was a ploy: sign the form, and suddenly you're a paying member. If you refused, you risked violations if the board decided to interpret your property as part of their territory anyway. Tensions soared. Our group realized the board was doubling down, determined to legitimize their overreach at any cost. In the midst of this chaos, a surprising ally emerged, Mr. Johnson, a longtime resident who had actually been part of the HOA board years ago. He'd stepped down due to personal reasons and had rarely been involved in neighborhood politics since. But after witnessing the HOA cop harass a neighbor's teenager about a skateboard ramp, Mr. Johnson reached out to me. He admitted he felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. According to him, the board used to function fairly, but after a change in leadership, everything became about revenue generation. He'd seen early drafts of their expansion plan, which explicitly targeted nearby blocks, not technically under the HOA's legal umbrella. Mr. Johnson produced meeting minutes that referenced strategic growth and maximizing membership. Though vaguely worded, it was enough to confirm that the new leadership had at least considered forcibly incorporating non-HOA properties. With those documents, we had an even stronger case that what was happening wasn't just random or mistaken, it was a deliberate strategy. Meanwhile, our group of fed-up neighbors continued to grow. We shared updates on a private messaging app and planned a showdown at the next official HOA meeting. The idea wasn't just to demand they stop fining us. We wanted them to acknowledge they had no authority over our properties in the first place. With Mr. Johnson's inside knowledge, we finally had a way to prove it in front of the entire community. The critical turning point arrived when the journalist released her first article, titled HOA Overreach, Fining the Unenrolled. It detailed multiple residents' accounts, my own included, of receiving bogus violations. She also published snippets of the meeting minutes Mr. Johnson had provided, painting a damning picture of an HOA bent on conquest. Public reaction was swift. Local social media lit up, condemning the board's actions. Several city council members chimed in, stating that if the allegations were true, this HOA could face legal repercussions. The board, sensing a full-blown PR crisis, hastily organized a town hall meeting for damage control. On the day of the meeting, the venue was packed. Board members tried to dismiss the article as sensational, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Then, one by one, residents, both within and outside the HOA, stood up to share their own stories of intimidation and unfair fines. The board's attempts to wave off each complaint seemed more desperate by the minute. Sensing the pressure, the HOA cop stepped forward, insisting he was just following orders. He tried to claim that all targeted properties fell under expanded coverage, but our group presented maps, deeds, and legal opinions showing exactly which streets were legally outside the HOA's jurisdiction. It was a pivotal moment. Either the board would admit its overreach, or we'd likely proceed with legal action that could dismantle the HOA's leadership entirely. The room buzzed with anticipation as I approached the microphone. With our evidence in hand, I addressed the board directly. "You have no legal right to fine me or my neighbors," I stated, projecting my voice so everyone could hear. I listed each instance of harassment, from random citations on my car to the HOA COP's bullying tactics. My final blow was showcasing property records, clearly excluding my street from their purview. Behind me, neighbors who'd been victims of similar harassment echoed the same sentiment. "We do not belong to your HOA." We displayed copies of deeds, legal disclaimers, and even historical documents confirming the development lines. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Their last hope of denial evaporated when Mr. Johnson, the former board member, revealed the meeting minutes he'd kept. He recited how under new leadership, the board had aggressively pursued nearby blocks to boost revenue. At that, the crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in outrage. Suddenly, the HOA COP stood up and tried to defend his actions, claiming he was merely upholding the rules. But when pressed buddies, he couldn't produce a single document proving we fell under his jurisdiction. The hush that followed felt electric. This was the confrontation that would decide everything. Either the board would back down, or they'd cling to a fragile facade of power in the face of overwhelming proof. Every eye was on the board members, who huddled together in a hushed discussion. Residents whispered among themselves, phones out recording every second. The air crackled with anticipation. Would they fold or double down? At length, the HOA president, looking visibly rattled, tapped the microphone. She attempted a final spin. "We believed the annexation was valid and had no intention to extort. If there's a misunderstanding, we can rectify it." But her words rang hollow. After months of relentless citations and intimidation, the community wasn't buying her sudden humility. The tension rose another notch when a local council member, invited as an observer, spoke up. She noted the large volume of evidence indicating the board acted outside its authority. "If these documents are correct," she said, "this HOA faces serious legal liability for issuing false fines. We'll be conducting a full review." The room pulsed with energy, a mix of anger at the board's audacity and relief that the truth was finally surfacing. After a pause, the president announced an immediate suspension of all fines for properties in dispute, but that wasn't enough for most attendees. We demanded a formal acknowledgement that our street was not under their domain. As the session ended, it was clear the real showdown was about to happen. The board had only bought time. The stage was set for a final resolution, one that would either dissolve the HOA's claims entirely or plunge us into an even bigger legal battle. 2 days later, the HOA called an emergency meeting, presumably to finalize their stance and avoid a looming legal onslaught. Word spread quickly, and our group arrived en masse, determined to close this chapter. The board, flanked by their attorney, tried to open with a formal statement about misinterpretations. But that didn't fly. One by one, we presented our final evidence. Our property lawyer stepped forward to make it crystal clear, this is not a misinterpretation. It's a fundamental legal boundary the HOA has crossed. They have no authority here. He cited specific statutes, referencing the original development plans and city ordinances that confirmed our street was never annexed. The HOA COP, conspicuously missing at first, eventually slipped in quietly. He had nothing to say when confronted with complaints about his excessive citations. In fact, he'd ceased his patrols the moment public scrutiny peaked. It was evident he feared legal repercussions for every ticket he'd written outside the HOA's actual jurisdiction. Finally, the board's attorney conceded. "Upon reviewing all documentation, we acknowledge these properties do not fall under the HOA. Effective immediately, we retract any violations or fines issued to them." A tidal wave of relief and applause washed through the room. But the crowd's mood turned from celebratory to indignant as people demanded an apology and a refund for previously paid fines. Backed into a corner, the board president mumbled a half-hearted apology and agreed to refund all funds collected from non-members. The entire exchange was recorded by local media, ensuring the public record would hold them accountable. In that climactic moment, the HOA's overreach was definitively quashed. In the aftermath, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Our properties were finally, officially recognized as outside the HOA's reach. Residents who had been subjected to bogus fines received their refunds, and the HOA COP was quietly let go. Rumors circulated that he faced additional investigations for issuing fines without proper authority. Meanwhile, the journalist who broke the story published a follow-up article detailing how a determined group of neighbors uncovered and dismantled a rogue HOA expansion scheme. The piece highlighted the importance of knowing your rights, checking your property lines, and refusing to pay questionable fees without verification. Our once divided community came together in a celebratory mood. Some neighbors painted their mailboxes bright colors or hosted barbecues, small gestures to rejoice in the freedom of not being under strict HOA regulations. The board's reputation was tarnished, and several key members stepped down, citing personal reasons. From my standpoint, the entire ordeal was a testament to the power of collective action. If I'd tried to fight this alone, I might have drowned in paperwork and intimidation. But standing side by side with others who shared similar experiences, we shone a light on the HOA's tactics and forced them to back off. If you found this story eye-opening, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Have you ever been hit with a fine from an HOA you didn't even belong to? Share your thoughts, and let's keep shedding light on the wildest entitled tales from around the neighborhood. Remember to subscribe and share if you believe in standing up to unjust authority, because no one should pay a dime to an HOA they were never part of in the first place.